There are people in this world who were born with something different inside of them. It is not a skill that is learned. It is not a technique that develops over time. It's something much deeper, much older, as if the souls of these people had arrived here, carrying a memory that the world still doesn't know how to name properly. You've probably felt it, that strange feeling of entering an environment, and even before someone says a single word, already knows what is weighing in the air. You've felt the emotional weight of people around you as if it were your own. Have you ever found yourself awake in the middle of the night, processing pains that are not even yours, internally resolving conflicts that happened miles away, carrying a fatigue that has no name and no certain address? This has a name, and this name, for a long time, and it was treated as weakness. They called you too sensitive. They said you complicate things. They suggested that you needed to toughen up, that the real world has no room for those who feel everything so deep. And for a while, maybe for a long time, you believed it. You tried to be different. He tried to erase that part of himself that feels the invisible, that hears what has not been said, that perceives what everyone pretends not to see. But here's what Carl Jung spent his whole life trying to tell us. What you've tried to hide the most is exactly what carries your greatest strength. The soul does not lie. It can be silenced for years. It can be buried under social roles, relationships that drain, routines that anesthetize. But it doesn't disappear. She waits. And when the right moment arrives, she wakes up with a clarity that frightens. This video is not for everyone. And I say that carefully because there's no arrogance in it. There's recognition. There is the respect I have for the rarity of what you carry. Most people will go through this entire life without ever looking inside with that depth. They will live on the surface. They will settle for easy answers. They will flee from silence because in silence, truths appear, and truths are frightening to those who have never learned to sit with them. But you're not that person. You never were. There is a specific moment in every empath's journey that I want to talk about today. A moment that very few people can describe with words, but that those who have lived it immediately recognize when someone names it. It is the moment when the intelligent empath, one who has been through enough, who has gone far enough within himself, realizes something that changes everything. A perception that has no turning back. A clarity that, once it enters, can no longer be undone. It is the moment when he realizes that the world, as it is organized, was not made for him, and that, listen carefully, is not a tragedy. It seems that it is at first. It hurts as if it were. It isolates as if it were. But over time, with the kind of quiet courage that only rare souls can muster, that realization turns into something else entirely. It turns into liberation. Because when you stop trying to fit into a world that was never designed for your depth, something extraordinary happens. You stop betraying yourself. You stop shrinking what you feel to fit into the small space that others have reserved for you. And you stop apologizing for seeing too much, feeling too much, perceiving too much. And at that very instant, a new identity begins to emerge from the ashes of the old. Jung called this individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, not who the world said you should be. It's a death. It's a rebirth. It is the scariest and most beautiful thing that a human being can experience. And that's what we're going to talk about today. In the next few minutes, we will walk together through this inner territory where few have the courage to enter. Let's talk about the pain that precedes transformation, about the isolation that is actually protection, about the shadow that needs to be integrated before the light makes sense. Let's talk about the end of an identity that was never truly yours, and about the silent birth of what has always been. If you've come this far, it's already a sign that something in you recognizes what is being said. And that recognition, that inner spark that ignites when the soul hears its own truth being spoken aloud, that recognition is the beginning of everything. Stay with me. What comes next is made for you. The realization that has no return. The day the empath sees what was hidden in full light. There is a type of knowledge that does not come through the mind. It does not enter by reading a book. It is not delivered by any teacher. It is not born from any conversation. He just shows up, like a light that suddenly illuminates a hallway that has always been dark. and you realize that the walls have always been there. You have never paid attention to them. Arna, this is the kind of perception that changes an empath forever. And when it arrives, there is no longer any way to pretend that it has not arrived. Carl Jung talked about moments of inner revelation as if they were encounters with something greater than the ego. It wasn't he who decided when to see it. It was the soul that chose the right moment to show it. And the empath, more than any other type of person, is subject to these moments with an intensity that most will never experience. Because the empath doesn't just think about things, he feels them to the bone. And when a truth hits that depth, it's not just registered, it's embodied. For a long time, the intelligent empath lived with a diffuse sense that something was wrong, not with him, but with the world around him. A kind of constant mismatch, like a musical instrument tuned in a completely different way from all the others in the orchestra. He tried to play together, tried to find harmony, tried to fit into the collective rhythm, but there was always that background noise, that frequency that didn't match, that something that insisted on not being resolved. And then the day came, not necessarily marked on the calendar, not necessarily dramatic on the outside. It may have been an ordinary afternoon, a seemingly banal moment, a conversation, a silence, a scene that was repeated for the thousandth time. But this time, something inside the empath didn't lower its gaze. This time he looked straight ahead, and what he saw was neither monstrous nor terrible. It was simply true. And the truth, when it is finally faced, has a weight that paralyzes for an instant before it releases. And what he saw was this. The world was not against him because he was weak. The world was conflicted by his presence because he was different in a way that bothers him. It doesn't bother out of malice. It bothers because the empath, simply because he exists the way he does, asks questions that others prefer not to answer. He feels what people hide. He realizes the contradictions that everyone pretends not to see. He carries an authenticity that, in a culture built on masks, is almost an involuntary provocation. Jung described this process as the moment when the individual begins to separate from the collective psyche. It is the instant when the soul stops accepting the definitions that the group imposes and begins to search for its own inner truth. For most, this process is slow, gradual, almost imperceptible. For the empath, it usually arrives like a wave, silent in formation, but absolutely overwhelming the moment it touches the coast. And here's the most beautiful paradox of it all. The realization that feels like the beginning of a crisis is actually the beginning of healing. Because while the empath didn't see, he lived in a state of constant tension, trying to adapt to something that was never meant for him, expending immeasurable energy to look like what he wasn't, paying a sky-high internal price to maintain a semblance of belonging that was never real. When he finally sees it, that tension begins to dissolve. Not all at once. The process has its time, it has its layers, but the direction changes. And changing direction, after years of walking to the wrong place, is the bravest gesture a soul can make. The pain no one can explain. Why the rare soul suffers in a way the world doesn't recognize. There is a specific pain that the empath carries, a pain that has no diagnosis in the manuals, that does not appear in the exams, that does not find an echo in common conversations. When he tries to describe what he feels, the words come out wrong, too big or too small for what really happens inside. And the world, which has always had to name things to accept them, simply shrugs its shoulders, not because it is cruel, but because he doesn't have the vocabulary for it. Carl Jung spent decades investigating the deepest layers of the human psyche and came to a conclusion that the empath immediately recognizes. There are kinds of suffering that don't just belong to the individual. There are pains that are actually the weight of something much greater being processed through a single person. The empath, with his extraordinary sensitivity, often functions as a conduit, absorbing emotions, tensions, and unspoken truths from the surrounding environment, carrying it all in his own body as if it were his own. This explains something that the empath has always felt but never been able to name: the tiredness that does not go away with sleep, the sadness that appears out of nowhere, for no apparent reason, in environments where everyone is smiling, the feeling of heaviness after certain interactions, as if something had been silently extracted. It is not weakness. It is not a disease. It is the natural consequence of a nervous system that was built to sense beyond the surface. But here's what makes this pain especially lonely. It's invisible to those who don't live it. The others see the empath and don't understand why he seems so overwhelmed when, apparently, nothing serious has happened. They don't understand why he needs so much silence, so much space, so many moments of recollection. They interpret their need for recovery as isolation, their sensitivity as drama, their depth as an unnecessary complication. And the empath, who from an early age learned to adjust himself to be understood, begins to believe in these interpretations. He begins to wonder if perhaps others are right, if maybe it really overcomplicates, if perhaps there was a simpler way to exist that he simply hasn't found yet. This doubt is perhaps the cruelest layer of the empath's pain, not what others do to him, but what he starts to do to himself. Jung called introjection this process in which we absorb the views of others about ourselves and transform them into internal truths. For the empath, who already has a naturally high emotional permeability, this process happens with a frightening speed and depth. He doesn't just listen to criticism, he embodies it. He doesn't just receive rejection, he transforms it into identity. But there is something that this pain carries inside it, hidden in its deepest layers, that most can never reach because they give up first. There is, at the root of all this suffering, a message, a piece of information that the soul is trying to pass on. And that message, when finally decoded, is not one of weakness, it's one of calling. The pain of the empath is, in essence, the sign that he has not yet found the right space to exist. It's the friction between who he really is and the mold the world has tried to fit him into. And this friction hurts. It really hurts. It hurts deep. But it is also what prevents him from falling asleep completely within a life that is not his own. Those who manage to get through that pain without numbing it arrive on the other side with something priceless: the ability to see themselves clearly, to understand what they are, and to know that neither answer needs external approval to be true. Sacred isolation, when to get away from everything is the only way to find yourself. There is a moment in the empath's journey when the external noise becomes unbearable. Not because it is fragile, but because the soul has reached a level of clarity that can no longer coexist with the noise of a world that speaks loudly and listens little. And then something happens that, on the outside, looks like a withdrawal. It feels like giving up. It seems, to the eyes that do not understand, a closure. But it's not like that at all. It is the opposite of that. Jung wrote about what he called the descent into the depths, that inner movement in which the individual must step away from the collective world to do the work that no other person can do for him. It is not an escape movement. It is a movement of concentration. It is the soul gathering its forces, withdrawing its attention from all that was scattered, preparing the ground for something that is about to germinate. The intelligent empath, when he reaches this point, begins to feel an irresistible urge to simplify, to eliminate, to create distance between him and everything he consumes without nourishing. Relationships that suck in without offering reciprocity start to feel unsustainable in a way that was previously just uncomfortable. Noisy environments, once tolerated, now feel physically painful. Superficial conversations, which were once just boring, now feel like silent violence against something precious that he is beginning to protect. And the world misinterprets it. He always misinterprets. They say that he has changed, that he has become arrogant, that he is isolating himself in an unhealthy way. And the empath, who still carries somewhere inside him the old reflex of justifying himself, of explaining it, of apologizing for occupying his own space in a different way, this empath feels the pressure to retreat, to open up again before you're ready, to go back to the noise because his silence bothers others. But here's what he needs to know. Sacred isolation is not punishment. It is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is, on the contrary, one of the clearest signs that something is going deeply right. It is the soul saying now is the time. Now the ground is firm enough for you to descend deeper without getting lost. In the traditions that Jung studied throughout his life, from medieval alchemists to indigenous rituals, from Greek mythologies to Eastern traditions, There is always a period of recollection before any major transformation. The hero needs to cross the desert before reaching the promised land. The chrysalis needs to isolate itself completely before the butterfly can exist. The grain needs to be buried in darkness before the plant can rise toward the light. The isolation of the healed empath is not the absence of life. It is preparation for a truer life. It is the necessary space for him to finally hear his own voice without the interference of all the other voices that have spent years speaking louder. And what he hears in this silence is extraordinary. He listens to his own preferences, separate from the preferences of others that he has absorbed without realizing it. He listens to his own fears, distinct from the fears he inherited from the environments he inhabited. He listens to what really matters to him, stripped of everything that mattered to please, to belong, not to be abandoned. Well, this is the gift of sacred isolation, the possibility of truly knowing oneself, perhaps for the first time in one's life. The shadow he was waiting for, the encounter with the part of himself that was buried to please the world. Of all the concepts that Carl Jung left us, perhaps none is as powerful, as necessary, and as misunderstood as the concept of shadow. Most people, when they hear this word, think of something negative. Think of the dark side, the hidden wickedness, the parts that are to be feared. But Jung wasn't talking about that. He was talking about something far more human and, paradoxically, far more luminous than any simple definition can capture. The shadow is everything that has been rejected, not necessarily because it was bad, but because it was judged unacceptable by someone at some point. And that judgment left a mark deep enough that the rejected party was buried. For the empath, this process begins very early. From a young age, he learns to feel what others need and to adjust himself accordingly. You learn that certain emotions are welcome and others are not, that a certain intensity is tolerated and another is not, that certain aspects of your personality receive approval while others receive discomfort, withdrawal, or rejection. And then he dunks. With the extraordinary ability he has to process emotions, the empath also becomes extraordinarily efficient at hiding from himself the parts he has learned to fear to show. He buries anger because anger scares the people he loves. It buries the limits because limits seem like abandonment for those who have never learned that saying no is also a form of love. It buries ambition because ambition seems selfish to someone raised to always put others first. It even buries joy sometimes, because too much joy in certain environments has always drawn attention of the wrong kind. But the shadow does not disappear. She waits. And this waiting is not passive. It is active, creative, insistent. The shadow appears in dreams, in disproportionate reactions, in patterns that repeat themselves, in attractions that make no rational sense. It appears in the people who irritate us deeply, because often what bothers us most in others is exactly what we refuse to see in ourselves. For the empath who is on the path to healing, the encounter with the shadow is not an option. It is a necessity. Jung was absolutely clear about this. It is not possible to become whole while parts of oneself remain in exile. My shadow integration is not an optional spiritual exercise. It is the core work of any real transformation process. And this encounter is frightening. It would be a lie to say that it is not. Because when you go down to where the shadow dwells and start looking at the parts that have been buried, the anger that has never been expressed, the boundaries that have never been set, the desires that have never been admitted, you come across something that seems strange, as if it were someone else, as if you didn't recognize yourself in that. But it's you. It's completely you. It is the part of you that the world did not want. And that is why it has been waiting in the dark, accumulating strength, growing denser with each year of denial. When the intelligent empath finally descends to that part and looks her in the eye, not with judgment, but with the compassionate curiosity that Jung recommended, something extraordinary happens. The shadow does not attack. She presents. She shows what has been hidden, and in that show, she releases an energy that was being used to keep the hiding place running. Integrating the shadow does not mean becoming what you have repressed. It means to stop being controlled by it. It means acknowledging that you are human in the full breadth of the word, and that this completeness is not a weakness to be corrected. It is a totality to be inhabited. the death of the person you pretended to be, the end of false identity, and the silence that comes after. There comes a time in the journey of the awakening empath when he realizes something that no one has told him before, perhaps because no one knew, or perhaps because the truth is always the last thing the world is in a hurry to tell. He realizes that the person he introduced to the world for so long was not him. It was a construction, a carefully crafted adaptation, piece by piece, over years of trying to belong, to be accepted, not to be abandoned. This perception does not come with judgment. It is not an accusation. It's just a serene and absolutely overwhelming clarity. That person who smiled when he wanted to cry, who agreed when he wanted to disagree, who stayed when he wanted to leave, who shrunk when he wanted to take up space, that person was real in the sense that he existed, but he was never true in the sense that he represented who he really is. Jung called this construction the persona, the mask we use to navigate the social world. Every person has a persona, and to some extent it is necessary. There is no life in society without some level of adaptation. The problem, which Jung identified with a precision that still chills today, is when the persona becomes so thick, so close to the face, that the person begins to be confused with it. When the mask becomes the identity. For the empath, this risk is especially high, because the empath is exceptionally good at reading what others need and delivering just that. This skill, which is genuine and valuable, can become a trap. It can transform him into a perfect mirror of the expectations of others, to the point that he himself loses sight of what is behind the mirror. And then comes death. Not literal, symbolic, but no less real because it is symbolic. The death of the false persona is a true mourning. Because even if that identity wasn't authentic, it was familiar. It was secure in a way that fake security often is. Predictable, known, with clear rules. The new life that begins after it has not yet been defined. And having no form is terrifying for someone who spent years clinging to external contours to know who he was. This period, the period between the death of the false identity and the birth of the true identity, is the most disorienting of the entire journey. Jung described this space as the nigredo in the language of alchemy, the stage of darkness, of dissolution, where everything that was solid falls apart before anything new can crystallize. It's the winter before spring. It is the longest night before dawn. The empath who is in this space often cannot explain what is happening. He knows only that something has ended, that he is no longer that, but he still does not fully know who he is now. And this estrangement, this feeling strange in the very world he has built, is not a sign that something has gone wrong. It is a sign that the process is working. It is the soul doing the work of clearing the ground. It is the interior refusing to be occupied again by something that is not true. The silence that comes after this death is different from all the silences that came before. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is a fertile silence. A silence that smells of beginning, that pulsates gently but consistently, with a presence that empaths him and learns to recognize as his own. This silence is where everything begins again, and this time, from a place that no one can take. The resurrection without witnesses, how real transformation happens away from everyone's eyes. The modern world has a serious problem with silence. There is a problem with the invisible, with what cannot be photographed, shared, validated by an audience. We live in a culture that needs things to exist in public in order for them to be considered real. And the empath, who grew up in this culture, absorbed it in a way that he may not even realize. The tendency to only believe in his own transformations when an outsider confirms them. But here is one of the most liberating truths Jung left us, and one that the world least wants to hear. The most profound and permanent transformations happen exactly where no one is looking. They happen in the silence of dawn, at the moment of a solitary walk, in the quiet instant when something inside reorganizes itself without warning and without fanfare. They take place without an audience, and they don't need an audience to be absolutely real. The rebirth of the empath is not an event. It is not a dramatic moment with a clear before and after marked. It's a process, a series of small awakenings, each one breaking down one more layer, each one releasing a little more of who they really are. And this process, for the most part, is completely invisible to the outside world. The people around you may not realize that something has changed until the change is already so consolidated that it is no longer possible to ignore. And even when they do, they rarely get it right. They say that he is different, that he is distant, and that he has changed for the worse or for the better, depending on how much the new version of him still serves his needs. But few can see what really happened, that a person found himself and stopped cheating on himself. Jung described individuation as a solitary path by nature, not because loneliness is the goal, but because no other person can make this path for you. No relationship, no matter how deep, can replace the encounter you need to have with yourself. No guide, no matter how wise, can cross your inner darkness in your place. And the empath, who for so long sought in others the reflection of himself, who needed external approval to know that he existed, who learned to define himself by the needs of those around him, this empath needs more than almost anything, and to learn to inhabit his own process without needing someone to validate him. This learning is difficult. It is contrary to everything he has built, but it is absolutely necessary, because as long as transformation depends on the testimony of others to be real, it will always be at the mercy of what others need it to be. Witnessless rebirth has a specific quality that does not exist in any other form of transformation. It belongs entirely to the one who lived it. It can't be taken away, challenged, reinterpreted, or diminished by anyone, because no one was there to create an alternative narrative about it. It's pure. It has integrity. It is, in the deepest sense of the word, yours. And when the empath emerges from this process, people will realize that something is different, but they won't be able to name exactly what. They will feel a solidity that was not there before, a presence that does not apologize, a calm that is not indifference. It is anchoring. This is the mark of real rebirth, the new irreversible identity, when the healed empath stops asking for permission to exist. There is a version of the empath that the world rarely sees, not because it is rare in itself, but because the road to it is long, it is demanding, and most give up before they arrive. This version is not the overloaded empath who absorbs everything and can't defend himself. It is not the empath who loses himself in others because he has not yet found himself in himself. It is not the empath who confuses sensitivity with fragility and who pays a daily price for existing the way he does. This version is the healed empath. The empath who went through the fire and came out the other side not hardened, but forged. Who went through symbolic death and discovered that what was reborn was infinitely more real than what died. Who integrated his shadow and found, in what had been rejected, resources that he never imagined he had. Who inhabited the sacred isolation and discovered in silence a company that he had never felt before, his own. Carl Jung believed that human beings were not here just to survive or to adapt. He believed that there was, in every soul, an impulse toward wholeness, a call to become completely what one is, without mutilation, without denials, without the concessions that everyday cowardice asks of us. He called this impulse the self, the deepest center of the psyche, the one that knows the way even when the ego is lost. The healed empath began to listen to this self, not perfectly, not without stumbles, not all at once, but consistently and increasingly. And this listening changed everything. It changed the way he relates because he stopped choosing connections based on the fear of being alone and started choosing based on what he genuinely nurtures. It changed the way he walks through the world because he stopped fitting into molds that suffocate and started looking for spaces that allow him to flourish. But perhaps the most profound change of all is this: the healed empath has stopped asking permission to exist. This sentence seems simple, but for those who have spent years constantly adjusting their own existence so that it is acceptable, so that it does not take up too much space, so that it does not feel too much, so that it does not shine in a way that embarrasses or threatens, this phrase is a complete revolution. Stopping asking permission to exist does not mean becoming indifferent to others. The healed empath still feels. It still cares. Sensitivity has not been erased. It has been integrated. It has become a force at the service of conscious choices rather than a vulnerability at the mercy of the needs of others. He still loves, still connects, still offers his extraordinary presence to the world. But now he does it from a place of abundance and not scarcity, of choice and not of fear. The new identity that emerges from this process is irreversible for a very specific reason. It was built from the inside out. Previous identities were fragile because they depended on external approval to sustain themselves. The approval disappears, the identity creaks, criticism appears, identity falters. But the identity that is born from inner work, from honest encounter with oneself, from the integration of one's own shadows, and from listening to one's own self, this identity does not need approval because it was not built to receive it. It was built to be true. And the truth has a stability that no outside opinion can shake. Jung said that the goal of psychological life is not happiness in the shallow sense of the word. It is completeness, it is wholeness. It is the feeling that you are living from the inside out, that your choices emerge from your deepest center and not from the expectations of the world around you. That completeness is what the healed empath finally found. And now that he has found it, there is no force in the world that can make him give it up. Because he knows with a certainty that needs no external confirmation that what he is truly, completely, without mass and without excuses, is enough. It always has been, and it always will be.